All right, everybody, let's get back to it. We're going to finish out our conversation about race and ethnicity. We're going to talk about kind of some history for a minute, and then we're going to get into, I think, the last part of this chapter. So, early colonization. At the time of the Declaration of Independence, the majority of the colonial population was of British descent, and almost everyone was Protestant. And in the years that followed, about 33 million immigrants from countries in Northwest Europe arrived. The major influx of immigrants arrived from 1880s to 1890s. This time was mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Asian immigrants first arrived in the United States in large numbers in the late 19th century and encouraged by employers who needed cheap labor. Some 200,000 Chinese people immigrated to the United States during this period. The Chinese Inclusion Act passed in 1882, and Japanese immigrants began to arrive not long after it was passed. In the U.S., shifting immigration patterns since the end of World War II have altered the demographic structure of many regions, affecting social and cultural life. Partly due to changes in the immigration policy, more than 3/4 of nearly 59 million immigrants admitted to the United States have been Asian or Latin American. Again, Asian is a very wide category. So just as a reminder, we do not want to homogenize those individuals, and you can actually look at country of origin. When you look up immigration data, the U.S. Census collects it, and also some of the other, though this last census is going to be a little interesting given the political clout around it. But you can look at the immigrants that come in to this country and all of it based on country of origin, which is really interesting to look at. Also, there are different refugee crises that are going to allot a particular kind of immigration that doesn't necessarily get counted in some of this information based on war-torn areas like Afghanistan and Iraq, and also in the Syrian refugee crisis, and also the particular one that is happening right now in Ukraine. So there are more than 44.4 million foreign-born individuals in the United States, causing of 13.6% of the total population. So when we talk about immigration, we're talking about a large quantity of individuals. And our population growth is not just happening via particularly like having children and carry on, but it's also still considerably a considerable percent of the population is still immigration, due to immigration. Now note, there is very, very limited amounts of immigration policies that impact immigrants from any part of Europe, any part of I think like Australia's, there's not much, there's not anything from, not a lot of policy against immigration from Canada. Like, it's have your documents and you're good, like not you're good to go. But the immigration process is considerably easier for those who come from primarily white European settled places. And there is a Bella, you're okay. Come here. You're okay. There's a considerable Bella. Bella, hush, please. Hold it down. But so there's a considerable amount of difference, and to deny or not talk about the racial and ethnic component to which that that division is happening in policy is to not acknowledge kind of the roots of colonialization and how all of these processes are still impacting individuals now. Black people in the United States by 1780, there were nearly 4 million slaves, Black slaves in the American South. Slaves had no legal rights, but were restricted through but resisted through disobedience, rebellion, and cultural creativity. And did this for the entire time slavery happened. So while we don't teach a significant amount of this in our history books, because again, of the way in which we center and or talk about slavery and just that particular period in history, we don't get to talk a lot about how much disobedience, how much rebellion, how much cultural resistance strategies and resilience strategies were used within these communities. And again, no one that was part of this was returned in any way to the cultural places in which they were actually from. So it's not like slaves got away and got to get back to that. That took an amazing amount of resources that were just not feasible at the historical period of time that this was happening. You might be able to go to different places um, in the North American continent, but getting outside of that was really, really, really challenging. The formal abolishing of slavery did little to better the lives of Black people. The Black Code simply replaced the old system of slavery with a new system of social, political, and economic discrimination. And so it's not like, hey, we got rid of slavery and all of these individuals got to be treated equally or even got to be considered citizens. It was just, hey, we can't own you, but we can still own your labor. We can still own, and we can still treat you horribly. You still aren't allowed in all of these social institutions. These social institutions are not there to benefit you in any way. And here, good luck. Also, we still expect you to assimilate into our particular cultural ideas, language, writing, religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A progressive movement of African Americans moved northward as agricultural work in the South became mechanized and industrialized. Development in the North created new jobs. Despite having lived in northern urban areas for generations, African Americans today still face conditions of neighborhood segregation and poverty that other immigrants faced upon arrival. So while your generational, usually there is a lot more room for European-based immigrants or even Hispanic-based immigrants to have more opportunities and more access to economic and educational opportunities as the generations go on into this country and as immigration status moves towards citizen. Black Americans really did not have the same level of hope or opportunities and still continue to be limited on those even now. Mexican American and Chicano refer to descendants of people who live in Mexican territory taken by the U.S. in 1848 or present-day California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Subsequent immigrants from Mexico. Latino refers to people that descended from Latin America. Hispanic refers to everyone living in the United States descended from Spanish-speaking regions, which is a significant portion of the world. The four main groups of Hispanics in the United States come from Mexico, Puerto Rico, El Salvador, and Cuba. So in post-World War II period, the early 1960s Mexican workers were admitted without much restriction. And this was because this helped to fill particular kinds of labor needs within the time frame. This period was followed by a phase of quotas on legal immigrants and deportations of undocumented immigrants. Today, undocumented immigrants continue to enter this country. They can be employed more cheaply than indigenous workers and perform jobs that most of the rest of the population would not accept. In the past decade, immigration from Mexico has decreased. Puerto Ricans have been divided about whether the island, currently the Commonwealth of the United States, should retain its present status or opt for independence or attempt to become the 51st state of the Union. This is politically all over the map. And a lot of that comes down to, again, colonialization, but not having a right to partake in any of the political processes that impact them. if you live in Puerto Rico and do not have residence somewhere else in the United States, you do not have a right to vote. You do not have a right to be part of the political processes unless you are, say, military or, again, have a residence somewhere else and you just also have a residence there, which limits, again, a lot of economically underprivileged areas. And because Puerto Rico is a U.S. held territory, the fact that the people that are elected there do not get to be part of the representative faction of the U.S. does stem from a lot of concern, does create a lot of concerns for that population and for how their future should look. As a group, Cubans have the highest family income of all Latinos. This is because most Cubans in the first wave of immigration were white collar professionals fleeing communism. The second wave of immigrants were less affluent, but they were also political refugees. A refugee is a person who's fled their home due to political, economic, or natural crisis. We're going to see a lot more ecological refugees probably as we move forward into more of these stronger hurricanes, stronger typhoons, rising sea levels, things of that nature. Asian Americans, about 6% of the population in the United States is of Asian origin. That includes Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, and Indian Americans form the largest groups, but it also includes significant numbers of Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese people living in the United States. And all of these are very distinct and different cultural backgrounds. So understanding that we have super big differences in cultural understandings and also how these groups interact politically on a global scale also means that the term Asian can be very offensive to a lot of these individuals because being grouped with individuals that are also the reason they are political refugees or the reason they might come to the United States in the first place can be very detrimental to entire groups of people. Most early Chinese immigrants settled in California and worked in heavy industries such as mining or railroad construction. Later, the women worked also in a lot of clothing industries, a lot of really harsh working environments for kind of producing things. During World War II, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans, despite their American citizenships, were forced to live in remote relocation centers. Relocation centers were no different than the relocation centers. And notice the language here and the quotations. They were sent to Japanese internment camps, is what happened in the United States. And we don't talk about it because if we talk about it, then we have to talk about why it was so wrong and why it was worth going in and being part of World War II against these internment camps in Germany. But it was fine for the US to do it to the Japanese literal citizens, like the US citizens that were of Japanese descent there in America. And those are conversations that become really challenging and become really hard. And so this ethnocentric view of the world and doesn't allow for a lot of critical thinking about the ways in which we have perpetuated the same harms and evils that we supposedly go out into the world and try to take out. And that's something that as a country, we're going to have to come to terms with in order to, and we're going to have to start actually acknowledging in order to really prevent it from happening in the future. Following the passage of the New Immigration Act in 1965, large-scale immigrations of Asians took place again. Educational attainment. Differences have decreased between Black and white Americans and levels of educational attainment. However, they still exist. The proportion of Black adults who at least have a high school education has increased from about 20% in 1960 to 88% in 2019. And that really, again, comes down to desegregating schools. That comes down to putting federal government and aid money into Black schools. It comes down to citizenship practices. It comes down to um, growing populations. It comes down to a whole lot of social issues, including Brown versus education decision by the Supreme Court, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, disparities in higher education attainment persist. 58% of Asians 25 and older have at least a bachelor's degree, significantly higher than the rates for both non-Hispanic whites adults, which is 36%, and Black adults, which are 26%. So when you look at, and again, some of these are viewed in some of your charts here. Employment and income since 1970, Black men and women's unemployment rate have remained around 2 times that of white men and women, and that comes down to a lot of features. It comes down to interaction with the justice system. It comes down disproportionately and discriminatorily. We're going to go with that's a word. And it also has to do with who's getting hired, who's getting fired, who's getting promoted, who's getting to be part of networks. It also has to do with, again, that educational attainment that we were just talking about. All of these things factor into unemployment rates in ways that we don't necessarily get to or have real big societal conversations about. There has been some debate about whether employment opportunities for minorities have improved or worsened. Statistically, on unemployment don't adequately measure economic opportunity because they count only those who are looking for work and not those who have substantially given up looking for work or what have you. The household income gap remains relatively unchanged. Disparities in health and healthcare among officially recognized racial and ethnic categories in the U.S. are well documented and become especially evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we really just saw anyone who has been discriminated against considerably are Black individuals here in the United States, and then anyone of kind of Spanish speaking countries. Really, those were where a significant portion of people consistently were dying more frequently of COVID. They were getting treatment further along in the process, having more illness that was that was more severe, less likely to have vaccines or healthcare that they could easily access. Again, that's going to come down to economic inequalities. That's going to come down to educational attainment inequalities. That's going to come down to how people are treated within the medical system. It's going to come down to a long and very concerning historical precedent for scientific research being done on Black and brown bodies in ways that were incredibly unethical and harmful and deceitful. It's going to come down to a long history of not being listened to as within the medical community. There's an extensive rationale for why that's happening. In April 2020, Black people were 13% of the United States population and accounted for 30% of the deaths of COVID-19. This inequality can explain, again, through all of these things that we were really just talking about, along with subpar housing and access to foods and resources, access to the ability to quarantine, access to the ability to have jobs that put you at risk more frequently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Residential segregation, neighborhood segregation has declined little over the past quarter century, remaining especially high in urban and suburban areas. Massey and Denton argued that the history of racial segregation and its specific urban form, the Black ghetto, are responsible for the perpetuation of Black poverty and the continued polarization of Black and white Americans. If you are interested in this book, I both have it and have read it for one of my graduate school classes. And it is a really, really, really interesting and enlightening text, and something that I would recommend. It can read statistically kind of dry and scientific at times, but there are also some really good books about this particular argument that are more humanizing and just feel better to read, or easier to follow, and aren't as stats heavy as well. And I can refer you to some of those if you are interested. Racial, as well as those on housing, school, etc. There's an extensive library that I am creating on the subject, with the hopes. I at EKU I will be teaching a class on this is sociology of race next semester, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we can get something like that here too. But if you are interested, we can work on maybe getting you guys transferred in as partial credit for those courses too, because I know within network it's easier to do. Residential segregation is connected to educational segregation. Obviously, the neighborhoods that end up predominantly white end up in predominantly better areas, end up with predominantly more schools that are better funded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And schools that are segregated in the South today are as segregated in the South today as they were in 1968. And I don't think that needs to be explained, but the gravity of that should hold some significant merit about why it's so important to continue talking about race in this country. Hey, okay, stop. I apologize. So political power. Obama made history. Hold on, this Bosco. Shh. You did it. You guys got it. That's all good. Walk away. Your butt feathers. All right. So Barack Obama made history being the first elected Black president of the United States in 2008 and reelected in 2012. His presidency exists within a larger trend of Black Americans making significant gains in holding elective offices. However, despite those gains, representation for any of our racial or ethnic minorities is just non-existent comparatively to their population percentage, if that makes sense. So you're going to have just a significant level of disproportionately underrepresented elected officials comparative to numbers. And if you're interested in that, I'm pretty sure I still have the Kentucky data as it stands currently. However, I think some of the local stuff's going to change too. Here in November. So after the elections, if you are interested, remind me and I will get you all the data on the demographic makeup of the Kentucky state representatives and such of that nature. As it will be inaccurate, fingers crossed, come the next election, and hopefully for a more equitable solution. I also like to remind that there's backlash for any kinds of these first in history's making. Every time you have progressive notions of representation, you're also going to have pushback to those representations. And that's important to kind of think about. We also, again, had our first woman of color, first woman vice president, first woman of color vice president, first with multi racial and ethnic backgrounds. So it's just incredibly important that we also acknowledge those moments as well. And let's see what else we've had several demographic shattering moments here in the most recent several election cycles. But I also well, I will do that here in a minute. Gender and race. So gender discrimination and racial discrimination combined make it particularly difficult for women of color to escape conditions of poverty. Between 1979 and 2018, the median usual weekly earnings for full-time and salaried white women grew 30%, while Black women's earnings grew by 20%, and Hispanic women's only grew by 21%. Although women have made strides in earnings in the past 3 decades, the stark race and gender disparities still persist. A division has opened up between the minority of Black people who obtained white collar and managerial and professional jobs, and the majority of those who living conditions have not really improved. And although there's been significant process in the fortunes of Black Americans over the past 5 decades, pronounced racial differences still persist. And we kind of talked about that consistently through this lecture. African Americans are still represented in white collar jobs, and especially in upper tiers of white collar jobs. The myth of the model minority masks discrepancies between and within Asian groups. Again, this is where we start to kind of filter out those ideas. Although 12% of Asian Americans lived in poverty in 2015, rates varied widely among some groups. So 35% of Burmese Americans and 17% of Native Hawaiians or Island Pacificers are 8%. And 8% among Filipino Americans. So that's a very different 8% versus 35% living in poverty. Is a pretty statistically sound difference. The model minority myth is used to pit minorities against each other and promote incorrect assumptions that if another minority group does not succeed in the United States, it must be because they didn't work as hard as Asians. But also, as you look in within those categories, you're also going to see again that differential that's much closer to some of the other minority populations in the United States. Latinos, the debate over Mexican Americans. So pessimists believe that Mexicans are becoming a racialized minority. Racialization, the process by which understandings of race are used to classify individuals and groups of people. As a result, the poor education they receive in impoverished neighborhoods, Mexican Americans end up being qualified for only the lowest rungs of the labor market. And this consistently perpetuates this economic instability, along with immigration. Notions of immigration are notions of immigrant, specifically Hispanic or Mexican immigrants stealing jobs from the U.S. labor market, stealing jobs, or creating and making it harder for Americans to create, for specifically white Americans to create economic success, undercuts the reality that the majority of Hispanic Americans are coming in with little education, which lacks them the ability to get the majority of the jobs that Americans would be applying for or trying to acquire. A lot of these immigrants are ending up in very impoverished neighborhoods, ending up doing manual labor jobs or under the table jobs within any kind of construction, farming, any kind of agriculture, labor that has to do with caring for domesticated animals or the keeping of land, such things like that. More optimistic views of Mexican American mobility points out that this is not true of everyone, and those who intermarry with white people have higher rates of assimilation and upward mobility. And that's again going to depend on the region in which you come from as well, because again, like it talked about earlier in the lecture slides, Cuban Americans have had proportionately much higher rates of success when it comes to economic stability than those who are coming from other regions in the Latin America. All right. Last bit here, I think. In the past, scholars looked towards intelligence to explain and justify inequality among racial groups, but we base those intelligence tests specifically on notions of cultural understandings that were specific and Eurocentric. So an example of this would be talking about a math problem where someone was going to the supermarket and buying a specific type of um, foods, and you didn't know they came in dozens because those fresh foods or what have you weren't accessible in your area, and you've never come across these kinds of foods. To know that, or not knowing what a bushel of apples was because apples were not something that you bought in the bushel or even knew where an apple you could get an apple, for example, or say vocabulary that was used particularly in middle class white academic circles as opposed to vocabulary that is used and language that is used in some of these other cultural communities. And that's important because these don't necessarily denote intelligence, they're denoting a particular kinds of cultural intelligence. And that's a very different thing because cultural intelligence of one person's culture that may not be your own does not necessarily make you incompetent or not of higher intelligence. And so we find really hard challenges in trying to come up with say, and we found the same issues in things like ACT testing and SAT, ACT and SAT, yeah, testing. And what ends up happening is these social factors have really big impacts on scores and therefore opportunities that come out of those scores. Cultural explanations for racial inequality are controversial, but have more adherents. They claim that the inequality between Black people and white people is determined by the cultures of the different groups. Specifically, there's a lot of assumptions about Black poverty being due to laziness or what have you, and not due to extensive amounts of inequality and opportunity access and education and all of the things that we've been talking about essentially through this lecture slides. Most controversial of these explanations came from the Moynihan report, which argued that Black families were crumbling because of a large number of illegitimate births, led to a situation which fathers were only marginally involved in the upbringing of their children, and mothers were ill-equipped to raise children on their own. This was exceedingly biased in its understandings, and it was also didn't account for the amount of injustice that was happening in the judicial system when it came to Black men and their rate of arrest and incarceration comparatively for the same crimes. It also talked about, it doesn't talk about the amount per capita of people, of white people that were also like on any kind of government aid comparatively to statistical numbers. It doesn't talk about historical factions. It doesn't talk about the long history of it just didn't get into any kind of the social aspects that lead to any kind of single parenthood or any kind of social pressures that were on single women of color. Martin Luther King Jr. responded to this report and argued that poverty, not culture, was the root of the problem, which has been consistently the conversation for an extended period of generations now, despite the fact that not much is happening to create any kind of equity within that system. One economic explanation for poverty hinges on the fact that subsequent generations of poor Black people experience the same lack of economic opportunity as the ones who came before. And we've talked a lot about that. And another one points to the differences in wealth from Black and white people, as most Black people cannot depend on inheriting any kind of home or savings from the generations before them. Many sociologists do not accept the idea of economic explanations are the major cause of inequality for Black and white Americans. These scholars point to anti-Black racial discrimination as continuing to cause the inequality from slavery to present day. And these things can also not be one or the other. These things can be intertwined and creating systemically a lack of access and opportunities to economic equality or economic situations that stem from assumptions and understandings based on discrimination and discriminatory policies. Perhaps the single most significant race-based explanation of Black and white inequality is the restoration of Blacks in physical space, the ghetto, which we talked about again extensively when we talked about oh, why is that name out of my head? When we talked about, let me go back and find it. Okay. Massey and Denton. So when we talked about Massey and Denton's book, sorry, I wanted to make sure that these people have names and they should be used extensively because they are incredibly brilliant social scientists who have really opened a lot of communication for there to be much broader conversations in our society about the ways in which we need to be talking about how race creates difference. So I hope that you guys got something out of this. I hope that it enlightened you. I know that there's a lot to these lectures. There's a lot embedded in these conversations. But please feel free to reach out if you want to have conversations about this. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out, and I will see you next week.